Hello, and a warm welcome to this online event from London. I'm Professor John O'Regan, Vice Dean International at the UCL Institute of Education, and I'm your chair today. Over the past 2 days, we've been looking at the impact of COVID-19 on education around the world. Yesterday, we heard from speakers in Asia and Australasia. Today, we're hearing perspectives from South Africa and from North and South America. We're holding these events in conjunction with the International Network of Educational Institutes, which brings together the IOE and 10 other faculties of education from around the world to support an international conversation about issues in our field. Our speakers today are colleagues from the INEI or INEI member institutions located to the south and west of the UK, for whom we hope this time of day isn't outrageously early or very late. A special welcome also to our audience members from outside the UK too. In terms of how this event will run, once I've introduced our panelists, we'll hear briefly from each of them about their education system's experience of COVID-19. But we want the event to be interactive and to address your questions. So please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to share your thoughts on what you're hearing and to post questions for me to ask the speakers. As I commented yesterday, the immediate impact of the pandemic on England's education system was dramatic. It also generated a national debate about how we as a society meet the needs of our poorest children. A Manchester United footballer, Marcus Rashford, emerged a national hero for standing up for those children and their families in the face of a government decision to stop the COVID-related extension of funding for free school meals for children from vulnerable backgrounds. The disruption to our school leaving exams also precipitated reform of our university admission system after decades of debate on the matter. But despite all the flaws and opportunities for reform it has highlighted, whether COVID-19 will fundamentally change our education system here over the longer term remains to be seen. In the meantime, as a faculty of education, our experience has reflected that of the scientists advising government on its broader response to the pandemic. The IOE's research evidence is part of the policy debate, but ideological motivations in government have regrettably confused the possibility of a more coordinated approach. Well, that's England's experience so far. To help us learn more about the experience of COVID-19 pandemic elsewhere, I'm delighted to introduce Glenn Jones from the University of Toronto. Glenn is Professor of Higher Education and Dean of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. He's author of over 100 publications, and his most recent books include International Education as Public Policy in Canada, 2020, and Professorial Pathways, Academic Careers in a Global Perspective, 2019. Also with us is Cathy Kell from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where she is Director of the School of Education and an Associate Professor specializing in language and literacy in education. Cathy has worked in that field since the early 1980s in South Africa and in New Zealand, covering language and literacy across the lifespan. Most recently, she's focused on digital technologies and early literacy. We then have Ana Luisa Jesus da Costa from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Ana is Professor of History of Education in Sao Paulo's Faculty of Education, where she works on the faculty's pedagogy course and graduate program. Ana also coordinates the faculty's Internationalization and Nationalization Commission. And lastly, on our panel, we have Erica Turner from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. A former teacher, Erica is now Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at Wisconsin. Her research examines how different groups, from school district leaders to students, make sense of and act on issues and policies in education, with a particular focus on racial equity. This year, she published the book, Suddenly Diverse: How School Districts Manage Race and Inequality. Having introduced everybody, it's now my great pleasure to hand over to our first speaker, Professor Glenn Jones. Glenn, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that kind introduction. I'd like to begin also by thanking the IOE for continuing your wonderful role in facilitating and supporting public debate of educational issues in the UK and globally, and to my colleagues at the INEI. It's wonderful to see you here. I very much value the collaboration that this network has had, and of course UCL has been a large part of that network. So my thanks to my colleague and for the IOE for its continuing leadership in this important area. If I were to try and summarize the shift in the education debate in Canada in just a few words, I would say it's been a transition from a conversation about success to a conversation about survival. Of course, any discussion about education in Canada has to be premised on the realization that we are a federation and we have a very decentralized approach to education and also to public health. And those discussions take place in the context of our 10 provinces and 3 territories. So sometimes generalizations become problematic, and they do certainly in the context of COVID, because of course we've seen different responses from the school system, and we've seen different provinces react to our public health crisis in dramatically different ways. But having said that, I think that if I were to go back to March and February of this year, the conversation would have been about success. It would have been about the notion of how to build on that success to further and address some of our key issues. Canadian education has, I think, developed a fairly strong international reputation for its success. We do well in terms of international metrics. We have a strong, highly respected teaching profession. We certainly have our frailties and our challenges. And those would include, of course, the need for continuing curriculum reform. There was a continuing discussion about our need to address the special needs of our Black and Indigenous students, the role of education in terms of truth and reconciliation in the Canadian context, the need to address climate change within education. Those would have framed a conversation at that time about how to build on the success of our system and ensure that it is more equitable, inclusive, and that every student is as successful as possible in that context. And then, of course, since the beginning of the pandemic and the transitions, this debate really has been dominated by a kind of institutional logic of public health and safety. And that notion of public health and safety has really subsumed almost all the other educational goals within the system. I don't want to overstate that, but I do think that the conversation has really been about kind of surviving in this context. So our schools have made quite different and radically different approaches to this, again, depending on the provinces, but it usually involves some attempt to combine in-person with virtual instruction. In some cases, it involved shifting timelines in terms of the curriculum and moving towards different semester systems. So there's been some quite dramatic and I would argue quite creative solutions. And I think a tremendous amount of respect has to be given to the leadership of our schools and to the teachers themselves. But this notion of survival is partly based on the sort of public health issues of COVID, but it's also the notion of a reality of a fluid and I would say destabilizing educational environment that we're in as we've seen rapid shifts relating to attempts to address particular emergencies that have emerged in particular jurisdictions. And we've seen a high level of anxiety. We've seen teachers that have been pushed to the limit, I think. Some of our school systems have run out of supply teachers, and so principals and others are trying desperately to essentially try and maintain these systems. Again, there's variation by province, but I think this notion of moving from success to survival has been the kind of dominant theme. And of course, the reality is we've had one short term that we've completed. We have a 6-month term as we roll over after the holiday season. And so I suspect that this conversation about survival dominating almost all educational goals will be where we are at, I think, over the next 6 months before we transition. I'd be pleased to talk about that transition. But in terms of leaving you with this thought, the notion would be this transition from success to survival. And that really has dominated the entire conversation about education in the last 4 months. Thank you.
Glenn, thank you very much indeed. Okay, so now I'm delighted to be able to introduce Kathy Kell from the University of Cape Town. Over to you, Kathy.
Good evening, everyone. And many thanks to you all, especially to UCL for initiating the collaboration. COVID's often described as the worst global crisis since World War II. The term shock is used widely. However, the entire population of Black people in South Africa have lived with chronic shock for decades, if not centuries, as conquest, colonialism, and apartheid totally shaped their lives. Since apartheid ended, a neoliberal economic path has perpetuated jobless growth and entrenched inequalities. The state has been instrumentalized by a predatory political elite for its own enrichment. We struggled through the HIV/AIDS pandemic, as well as what's called an epidemic of violence against women. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world with a bimodal education system, where a small number of privileged children have access to some of the best education in the world, and the rest face what amounts to an ailing system. Less than half the learners who start at grade 1 will enter grade 12. Government has not fulfilled its own norms and standards for infrastructure provision. 3,100 schools still have pit latrines, and class sizes can go as high as 70 or 80 learners. One principal recently said, "We don't have what we call a school." Shock is therefore not something new or sudden to the vast majority of South Africans. The point I'm making is that the effects of poverty and inequality can be as insidious as COVID, just less visible. Prior to COVID, the government's focus was on consolidating the credibility of the national education system, demonstrating improved achievements in standardized assessments and throughput, with the main focus on our school leaving exam. Economists working in education have been central in prioritizing discourses of performativity under the refrain that high-stakes testing and measured improvements in educational outcomes lead to post-school opportunities and economic productivity. Education as the panacea for our economic woes. These dominant discourses turn on notions of improvement and strengthening, with measuring focusing on what looks good in order to garner belief in a credible and fair system which provides opportunities for all and is seen to redress previous discrimination. A modernist technocratic vision which is contested by many educationists. I don't wish to underplay what's happened under COVID. South Africa had one of the earliest and strictest lockdowns in the world. 3 million people have lost jobs. A new 4 million are living in extreme poverty. Over 9 million children have lost access to school feeding, which was only restored after a court case brought by NGOs against the Department of Basic Education. COVID has led to the inequalities becoming starkly visible. The advantaged schools carried on with remote learning using digital technologies. The poorest schools, the problems outlined earlier, continued, but were magnified. There was initially an absolute hiatus on formal learning. With only 10.5% of South Africans having access to the internet, remote learning was not remotely possible, and returning to school was extremely difficult with much opposition. Once schools did reopen, maintaining the credibility of the system took priority, with major efforts going into getting the grade 12 through the final national exams. Only 50% of these learners had access to the internet, and classes continued often over weekends, supplemented with inputs through radio and television. Efforts in the lower grades involved trimming the curriculum, adjusting timetabling, reducing the number of subjects taught, and revising annual assessment plans to try to keep the year on track. School staff recorded extreme numbers of comorbidities, and insufficient teachers and learning spaces mean that some learners are only learning for 1 day a week, and there's relatively high absenteeism. Teachers have put in heroic efforts to continue engaging with learners through inventive uses of mobile phones, particularly using WhatsApp. The biggest effects will be felt next year with increased heterogeneity amongst learners in classes, given the incredibly uneven access to learning this year. The focus now is on quantifying learning losses. This is a bleak picture, but there are hopeful signs. Instead of taking the usual blame for the system's woes, teachers are being better narrativized in the public discourse, and this matters. Awareness is growing of the problems with our overloaded curriculum, along with growing skepticism about high-stakes testing and the discourse of performativity. People are asking what really matters for learning and for schooling. Teachers, although exhausted, have glimpsed something different. They are in some ways closer contact with learners and their parents and have had the chance to teach classes that are half their usual size. Cross-group coalitions have been forged in dynamic neighbourhood-based community action networks, and these successes are noted in the field of education. Academics have worked with NGOs to build a National People's Coalition, producing parents' guides for working with children at home. Some have worked with research institutes on real-time research, others with government departments, developing strategies for supporting learning at home using print materials, identifying priorities for curriculum design, and the training of interns to act as support networks with families. We aren't able to reimagine our education system, certainly not with regard to learning through technologies, building public-private partnerships, and the much-vaunted 4IR. But these signs can help challenge the myth of the credible system maintained through testing and improvement regimes. This may create space for a view which prioritizes education as a public good, built on pedagogies and an ethics of care, involving the urgent reimagining of our learners and our teachers in terms of their humanness, and of principals who might be able to say with pride that they do have what you can call a school, and dare we hope much more than that too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for a most powerful intervention there, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more to talk about on that. So let me now move to our next speaker, who is Ana Luisa Jesus de Costa from the University of Sao Paulo. So Ana, over to you.
Hi. Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel. On March 17, 2020, the School of Education of São Paulo, of University of São Paulo, suspended in-school and in-office activities. During the first weeks of social isolation, we concentrated our efforts on keeping in contact with the academic community to help and guide our colleagues, staff, and students due to the multiple crises caused by the pandemic. And as a result, a permanent committee was created. In the beginning, we didn't intend to keep regular distance learning activities, but later that proved to be unavoidable. As the pandemic continued, additional actions were introduced, such as surveys on ICT access and usage, as well as on students' physical and mental health, aiming to offer material and psychological support, guidelines for administrative work adjustment, intense debate with the community about the moment we are living and the procedures to be taken, and the creation of virtual spaces for knowledge exchange and mutual help. Also, a digital strategy support group was created to assist faculty members with technological support for the implementation of remote activities. On our website, a tab named Education in Times of Isolation was introduced, containing relevant tests, videos, and podcasts about education during the pandemic, which were produced and or shared by members of our community and other participants. I will base my presentation on this material. First of all, we'd like to express our sincere solidarity of the thousands of victims of COVID-19 and pay our respect to the families around the world that have lost their loved ones, especially in Brazil. International news has shown the catastrophe we've been facing, with over 108,000 deaths, resulting in the near collapse of the health system in some Brazil states. The political response to the crisis, especially by the federal government, has increased the severity of the situation. Their irresponsibility attitude towards people's lives is evident when we hear statements such as, "So what? I'm sorry. What do you want me to do?" given by President Bolsonaro last April, when the number of deaths in Brazil reached 5,000. In this scenario, public institutions from basic to higher education have worked without the necessary coordinating and guidance from the Ministry of Education. Despite that, there's been several different initiatives. State and local governments have made content available on virtual platforms provided by the private sector, on TV, or as printed material. Those are attempts to keep instructional delivery during the crisis due to the impossibility of having access to schools. However, researchers and professors' critical analysis call the attention to the educational policies which insist on keeping the number of school days and schedules for the academic year, but fail to consider the students' and teachers' reality, especially when it comes to public schools and those in the outskirts of the country's main cities. We propose to examine three aspects of Brazilian reality: availability, accessibility, and use of ICT, adapting to online learning and working at home, and providing for basic needs in a sanitary and economic crisis. According to School of Education researchers Professor Iracema Nascimento and Patricia Santos, 2018 National Telecommunications Agency data revealed that only 90% of Brazilian socioeconomic groups (DNE) have a computer at home. 55% of mobile service access are prepaid, and 33% of households have no kind of internet access. Moreover, in many families, there's only one phone, while different members of the family need it to their homework and school assignments. Regarding physical space, in most households, it's difficult to establish a specific place and time to study, especially for online meetings. It's common in Brazil that whole families share 2 or 3 rooms house. And I mean rooms, not bedrooms. That is, a kitchen, a bathroom, and another room, for example. Examining the female teachers, who are both mothers and professionals, we can observe the contradictions between remote teaching and basic needs. Most precarious works have no right to social isolation, and now they also need to help their children with the school routine. Likewise, female teachers, when away from classroom activities, had the housework added to their chores, increasing their workload. Nonetheless, the total number of instructional days continue being considered, while the responsibility of learning loss has been transferred to the students, their families, and the teachers. In short, we agree with Nascimento and Santos, who claim that even though it's not up to the education system or the schools to solve Brazilian society's structural problems, such problems can't be ignored either. To conclude, we are facing a sanitary crisis which has caused a severe impact on education. The consequence raises expectations about the need of stronger public policies to fight the already existing inequality and exclusion, which were exponentially increased due to the pandemic, and will continue to require our special attention in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you indeed for bringing us up to date with circumstances and events in Brazil. All right, I'll move now on to our last speaker, our final speaker, and that's Erica Turner from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. Erica, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And thanks everyone, and including my fellow panelists. I've learned so much and seen some really interesting connections as well across the countries. In the US, I think it's important to note that COVID-19 has been unfolding during a time of ongoing mass uprisings against racism and specifically against anti-Black violence. Mm-hmm. And together, these two, the pandemic and the uprisings, have brought greater attention to the longstanding racial inequality in U.S. schools and society, inequalities that the pandemic has very clearly exacerbated. So, as Kathy mentioned, I think many of the things we're seeing are not new, but a brighter light has been shown on them. So, for example, in the spring, school closings in the U.S. limited families' access to childcare, food, jobs, and healthcare, particularly low-income families of color. And in the U.S., our schools are often the conduits for those kinds of social welfare supports that we don't really have in other forms in the U.S. In lieu of a federal response, a comprehensive response to the pandemic and its effects on schools in the U.S., we also see resource disparities along lines of race and class. And these have clearly allowed some children, families, schools, and school systems to be relatively untouched by the pandemic and to be able to continue schooling, whether it's in person or remotely, while others have little to no access to formal education during this time. So, for example, there's a lot of news about learning pods, wealthier families able to hire a private teacher for their children or a minder of some sort, buy the technology they need to get online and to keep their children safe, while still, our states are struggling to make sure there's connectivity for those who are in remote learning. Some students are not receiving any instruction at all. Other concerns that have arisen related to equity include social emotional health and learning loss. And I kind of put that in quotes because I think that's a term that could be scrutinized in greater depth. But I think it's clear that inequity in education in the US society, it's so visible through the pandemic. And I think we've seen, because of that, some openings to address these problems, although I'm not overly optimistic on that point. But I think it's important to note in the US that the system, unlike in so much of the world, is highly decentralized. So Glenn talked about the provinces in Canada. In the US, we have approximately 13,600 local school districts, and this allows for a lot of inequality between local communities and the resources available for schooling. But it also means that these local communities and education leaders are making independent decisions about how schooling occurs in the pandemic. And they need guidance and strategies on these issues. So it's really hard to say what's happening in the US because there's so many different things happening. As others noted, there's hybrid, there's in-person, there's moving between hybrid and in-person, there's entirely remote, etc. In the school community where I'm a parent, we were concerned about the inequity and injustice in education and about how that's being exacerbated under the pandemic, and we wanted to take action. But we weren't really sure what to do. The guidance hasn't been there, as it's been the expectation that a lot of localities make these decisions on their own. And so as a researcher who studies racism and inequity and efforts to challenge those in education policy, I've been following these issues carefully, and I wrote the guide that we wanted to read in this group, this school community group. The guide is called Equity in Pandemic Schooling, and briefly it tries to identify 4 distinct and intertwined issues of inequity and injustice that are in play in the US. And again, these aren't new, but they include the ongoing racism in schools and society, the undermining of public education that's occurring at this time in conjunction with the pandemic, white flight and opportunity hoarding among more privileged families, and the disproportionate stress and work of childcare. And so following this kind of framing, this understanding of the inequities that are at play, and following research knowledge on inequity in education, we tried in the guide to shift the conversation away from questions about your individual child and your individual decisions. What should I do with my own child that isn't inequitable in a system that is inequitable? And we try to reframe these issues to focus on collective, structural, and equitable change. The guide offers 10 broad actions, from contacting Congress to demand additional school funding and family supports, to ending high-stakes testing, to working with families and educators in one school to identify needs and share resources. And maybe I can share a link to that if folks are interested later. We have had families and education leaders, community members from across the country share the work in their circles and use it. And it's giving me some hope that we have new opportunities to act and to address educational inequality, both in the present related to the pandemic and that ongoing issues that have been part of the system. And I bring this up because I think this guide is one way that researchers such as myself have been involved in responding to the pandemic in the US by providing what Professors Gary Anderson and Michael Dumas call policy knowledge. And that's information and ideas useful in framing and deepening our understanding of and or enriching our conceptualization of policy problems, as they write. It's the framing of the problems and the framing of the kinds of solutions that are needed. And I've seen other scholars do this in the US in conversations with educational leaders and in the media, and I'm sure in your countries as well. Other researchers in the US are responding by partnering on research with school systems. At UW-Madison, the School of Education, we have a partnership, an equity-focused partnership with our local school district. And I'm on the steering committee where we've seen a record number of researchers interested in partnering with the district on research that can benefit the schools as they try to address learning during the pandemic. Certainly, some are continuing to go about their work with little evidence that they're changing anything they're doing, as if not much has been different. And I think this goes again to the great inequalities in the way the pandemic affects people's lives or doesn't. Other research, especially those researchers, especially those who are managing heightened caregiving responsibilities with unchanged work expectations or maybe heightened work expectations under the pandemic, are essentially just getting by. So there's some research who I think just are not really able to respond in a research capacity beyond as educators. Finally, I see some research responses that concern me in the US, setting out plans and making pronouncements about what is safe when we have limited knowledge about COVID-19 and about education in the pandemic. And for many of us, limited knowledge about the effects of the virus and school closures on communities that are most impacted in their health, educations, and jobs by the pandemic. And in the US, this is mostly low-income people of color and low-wage workers, immigrants who have been denied access to food, housing, and healthcare, work in low-wage jobs or are unemployed now, and live in intergenerational families where there's greater concern about spread of the virus to vulnerable family members. So I think we need to hear from these families, and without doing so, I worry that or fear that some research will ultimately exacerbate educational inequalities rather than help us move towards a more just school system. So in sum, I want to suggest to the group that we have an opening to address educational inequity, but we need researchers who contribute policy knowledge and not policy prescription moving forward.
Thank you very much for that overview there, Erica. Indeed, thanks to everybody for their particular contributions in their own context. I mean, clearly, what we all seem to experience here is the shared issue of inequality and inequity during the pandemic. And it's clear that given the makeup of our panel today, there is indeed a difference in experience between the global north and the global south, if you'll allow me to use those terms. And we can certainly see in what Anna and Kathy have said of the very difficult situations which they face in their own national contexts. But then again, what we find is we come to the global north, and in the United States and Canada, there are also great issues of inequality. And what the pandemic seems to have shown up more than anything is that it has shone a light on the inequality of the kinds of societies which we have created in the digital age. And what we find is that all these inequalities have been heightened, particularly for marginalized groups. And one of the questions that has come up actually here in the chat line, there are a few here, which I'll try to take, is in respect of what we're dealing with in this pandemic. Young people in schools, students in universities need to get access to the internet. They need to go online. In places like Brazil and other places, people have been using their mobile phones instead of the internet. But what is the panel's view on establishing universal access to the internet as the, capital letters, most important factor now in addressing educational inequality? I'd go to you first, Erica, because you were talking about inequality, but I think I'm actually going to go and I'll start with Kathy. Kathy, what do you think of that as a approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point. I think universal access to the internet could make a huge difference, but it's not a panacea in itself. It's not going to be the silver bullet. I hate to use that term, but it's because learning has to be mediated, and the access. There's this new discourses of self-directed learning have sort of come out during the pandemic. For us, self-directed learning is not going to work. I'm not saying our students don't have resources themselves and they don't have capacities themselves, but learning has to be mediated. And we know that one of the hugest losses during the pandemic has been the loss of the kind of deeply relational kind of quality that learning is about. So it's not enough. It's not enough. It's one step along the way. But to think that technologies in themselves can make a difference is very naive to me in terms of our understandings of learning.
Okay, thank you. Would anybody else like to follow up on that in particular?
I would just jump in to.
Sure, Glenn.
Well, I would just jump in to agree with Kathy. I mean, I think that in Canada, the conversation about internet access has to do with rural and northern communities. And there's been some indication of the federal government to increasing expenditures in this area. So, I mean, clearly that's an issue, but the inequities we're seeing tend to be in our urban environments. They tend to be amongst those who do have internet access, but they are in communities where facilities are shared, where you have multi-families in the same situation. So it's part of a solution. But I think if we're going to talk about broader issues of equity, and in Canada, those conversations largely focus on our Black and Indigenous populations. Technology is a small component of that problem, and it's I think important to recognize that it will accomplish something, but the broader inequities we're trying to address, technology isn't the solution.
Thanks very much, Erica. Did you want to add anything there?
No, I think that's really covered. I'll just say for some of our youngest kids, are 4, 5, 6, and 7, even having the access, they're missing so much because it's really not a very good way to teach that age, especially. I think that's been very hard, right?
Sure. I mean, what I think it points to is really that we can talk about the problems of our societies and the inequalities of our societies, and we can talk about ways of trying to address those within the context in which we are. But it seems to me that we always come back to the same issue, which is there is a structural issue which needs to be addressed, which is not really being addressed, in my view anyway, with regard to the nature of the societies which have been put forward as being the kinds of societies we need to create in order to be economically integrated and moving forward and progressive. And what we find actually is the reverse, that they just seem to exacerbate the inequalities. I don't know if Anna would like to come in at all on any of the points that have just been made. Would you like to say anything, Anna?
Hi, John.
Hi.
Yes, just a minute, please. And I would like to say that in Brazil, one of our main demands is the democratization of the internet access. But more than that, basic life conditions, jobs, dwelling are still big issues and challenge. Any answer to those challenges must deal with the social and racial inequality.
Thank you very much. All right, well, I've got several questions here in the chat line, so I'm going to pull one out here to do with teacher education, and it can be specific to your individual universities. This is from Brett Walker, but how has this year, and what have you learned from teacher experiences with teaching under COVID for the future of teacher training? So how has teaching under COVID, what has it told you about the future of teacher training? Have there been any policy changes or new courses developed to better prepare these pre-service teachers? I think, Glenn, you were talking about transition earlier, and that was something you were very strongly thinking about. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, I mean, a couple of tentative responses. I mean, teacher education has been particularly challenged, of course, by this experience, because if the schools are fluid and in transition, the position of teacher candidates in those schools and their practicum experience are also unstable. So we've had students who have had wonderful in-person experiences, others who are working in virtual classrooms. So we've tried our best as a school of teacher education to try and find practicum experiences for students. But this has been a very challenging phenomenon. and I'm sure it is across the world, as the schools become destabilized and in fluid situations with rapid changes, the position of students in practicum experience also becomes equally challenging. I think if we've learned anything, it's probably that technology will continue to play a role in schools to a degree that it hasn't in the past, and that we probably need to do a much better job in our teacher education programs to help students understand both the possibilities, challenges, and problems associated with that technology, and how it can be used in the context of promoting student success and promoting student access, but also recognizing its limitations. And I think our emphasis on technology probably hasn't been what it should be. And I think that's become exacerbated as we understand both this environment, but as we think about the transition to a new environment. There is a danger, of course, that there will be some in leadership positions who will view technology as a kind of panaceic response as we think ahead. Notions of efficiency and other kinds of rhetoric are already creeping into these conversations, and so we need teacher educators who are aware of both the possibilities of how to use these technologies to improve the student experience, but also aware of the serious problems we may be getting ourselves into. And the need to focus attention on the quality of the student experience, however it's delivered.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Would anybody like to add to what Glenn has spoken about thus far? Any thoughts on that? Okay, well, thank you. Thanks very much. I mean, I think that's a very comprehensive response that Glenn gave there. So I'm going to move on to another question here. I've got one. Let's see. What have we got? We've got one here about the impact of COVID is such that it generates an impetus to properly address existing problems in our education system rooted in deep inequalities. I think actually we have answered that. So I'm going to go to a different question, and I think I will select the issue of teacher fatigue. Teacher fatigue is a real problem right now. Who else might mobilize in their place to push for the kinds of changes the panel have indicated are needed? So teacher fatigue, Erica?
Yeah, I think I was just on a call last night with parents, and many of whom are also teachers in both higher education or in K-12 education, and also some of the teachers in our kind of equity group, again, at my kids' school community. And I think we can really hear the teacher fatigue there. I think it's hard when we still want to be pressing schools to be improving and addressing inequalities in places where they already existed, because it can seem like extra work. But it still needs to happen. So I think what we're seeing in general is in some places where the school systems in the U.S. Have tried to really connect with local community groups, childcare and after-school organizations and school-based organizations to provide more space and staffing for remote learning when it happens. And there's a kind of an interest, I'm not sure how it will materialize or how deep it will or how much it will continue in partnering with families and these community groups in this moment. I think that's a potential lever, especially when, not that families are also not incredibly exhausted by the current situation, but I do think that's a potential lever in a group that has a lot of stake in seeing these things pushed forward. Things like standardized testing will cut across interests of teachers and families and communities in many cases, and could be a place to mobilize together. And I was interested to hear Kathy's example of how that's happening among some groups in South Africa, and see a little bit of that in the US as well.
Yeah.
Actually, yes, I was going to ask you, Kathy, if you wanted to come in there from the South African perspective.
I think it's a really difficult one, and I don't have a lot of answers. And maybe, I think that what's happening in South Africa is, and maybe this answers, I see Michelle asked the broader question about that you passed over a bit there, John, is that there is a deeper kind of questioning of what the role of the school is in the community, And I think that if communities start to take on that question more, they can provide more networks of support to schools as well. So I think there are, this is the more positive, some of the more positive little sort of threads or traces that we could see, which is that there is a kind of growing awareness of the role of the school in the community, what role the school plays. But I also think, to come back to the teacher training question, is that I think technologies, they're two-sided. I mean, I think that they can play a role in supporting teachers as well. We have a newly qualified teachers program, which has been absolutely invaluable this year in supporting teachers who are in their first jobs. And you can imagine teachers this year being their first year as teachers. The role of technologies was actually really positive there. Teachers were experimenting, innovating, sharing, accessing materials. And so the one positive is that this idea of a kind of a knowledge commons, and that we are actually accessing materials, we are accessing across national boundaries, into continental boundaries, and so on now. That's one of the positives, is that it's not going to be easy for teachers, because teachers don't want a whole lot of technologies on what they're already doing. But if they start to use them more flexibly and more interactively, I think that there are some possibilities there for teachers gaining support and building networks and so on.
Thanks very much, Kathy. What you were saying in terms of schools and the local context with schools, there's been a few questions here, one from the Chilean context and one from the Brazilian context, which is about the role of schools of education and what influence they can have upon policymakers. You talked, Kathy, for example, of an ethics of care. Given that neoliberal forces are so deeply ingrained with the logic of who cares, which is actually something that Bolsonaro said some months ago, and indeed Anna, I think she mentioned that in her own talk. I was just wondering about what we see the role of our schools of education can be in this respect. I mean, I know from many years of experience, it's always very, very difficult to persuade policymakers. We can do the research, we can tell them what we know, we can tell them the science even, but very often they have other kinds of priorities. I don't know, would anybody like to take that one up? I mean, you talked about an ethics of care, Kathy, but any thoughts on the role of
I can come in there. I mean, I think it's absolutely crucial. And I think what I was trying to point to in my talk is that there's sort of conflicting discourses and pressures, the pressure of sort of towards kind of the strengthening and improvement, this sort of almost this kind of mythical kind of content to the system that, it's improving and it's strengthening, but we know it's not. Underneath it and behind it is a broken system. And that if the emphasis is on the incremental improvements, understanding standard deviations in this kind of outcome and these assessments and so on, but actually what schools of education can promote is a different sense about what education is for and what schools are for, what learning is about. And because of this, the kind of challenge to people can see that we are losing this kind of deeply relational kind of quality that learning is really about, and that the pandemic has made that clearer now. That without that, we fall into old, transmission styles of pedagogy, very thin forms of self-directed learning, and so on, hollowing out of what learning can be about. And I think that kind of general knowledge is actually increasing in society a little bit. It's increasing through the kind of work that I think Erica so beautifully talked about, of policy knowledge, not policy prescription. So to me, I think that's where educationists can play a role and challenge some of the work of economists who are driving so much of the work in education.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I wonder, Anna, would you like to come in on anything that Kathy has said?
Okay. So in Brazil, we struggle to keep public university working, and it's there where knowledge is made. But we suffer with a government that denies science and attacks ideologically and economically the public education. It's a big problem now. It's an opportunity to show it to the world, to the audience.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I've noticed that in the chat line there is a return to this issue around the technology and how the technology is actually being rolled out in many ways. And so, for example, Kelly Gingrich says, thank you for all your insights. Could you speak more to the concern around online education being outsourced to big tech companies in regards to openings for privatization, data privacy of students, digital capitalism, etc.? I mean, certainly in the UK, in the way in which the UK has managed the pandemic and the creation of a test and trace app for following up on people who have been in contact with others who've been infected with the virus. The way in which this has been constructed in the UK has been effectively put into private hands and not with very effective outcomes, if I say so myself. I wonder, would anybody like to talk about what they think about how the tech is being rolled out in the context of education? Glenn, would you be interested in speaking on that?
I mean, I think the answer in Canada would be unsystematically. I mean, largely what people are doing is they're rolling out based on platforms that existed before. We haven't seen so far a kind of privatization movement. There are governments in this country where I would worry a little bit about that next transition as we think about moving forward. I mean, my sense is that we're in survival mode. And the question isn't about sort of what we're doing now. The question is what happens in June, July, August, and September as we move from this mode into whatever the next phase might be. And I'm not going to use the phrase new normal because it's a terrible phrase. And it strikes me that we're going to see some things happen. I mean, clearly the political importance of education has increased. There's been a recognition of the tremendous importance of education, perhaps first to the economic system in the sense of the fact of the need for childcare and other resources, but also I think a recognition in a broader population of how hard this is as parents try and support their children in the context of virtual environments, and we see the challenges associated with this and a greater public recognition, I think, of teachers and teacher education. So I think one of the things that comes out of this would be, at least in the Canadian context, continuing strengthening of the kind of unionization and union organizing of teaching within the system. We have a long tradition of this, and I see greater alliances between teaching federations and other union and labor organizations, a recognition that this is a very difficult and challenging task, and that while people have been able to put up with this kind of survival mode for a period of time, the next phase of this has to somehow include a greater recognition of the professional role of teaching and a greater recognition of our need to ensure that these are reasonably paid professionals who have appropriate working conditions. So I think that's one of the things that comes out of this. And then the context of technology then is about how do we support teachers in this use? How do we make appropriate decisions about the use of technology? And I think we're a long distance away from that conversation. We're still in survival mode. And I'm somewhat hopeful that as we transition, a lot of these conversations will open up again in a new way. I agree with those. There are governments that listen to evidence and there are governments that don't.
Yeah.
And the question is will we end up in a situation where, in the context of COVID, where so much attention has given to evidence, in some cases wisely, and in some cases through skepticism, The question is whether our governments will continue to pay attention to the kind of evidence emerging from faculties of education about the quality of student experience.
Thanks very much, Glenn. I mean, in terms of what we are learning from this, I mean, we're obviously learning a lot. One of our experiences in the UK is that we are supposedly a part of the United Kingdom. Here in England, we're part of the United Kingdom. But the kingdom has not been very united in the way in which it has approached the pandemic. And there are different responses. And indeed, given the federal system in Canada and indeed what Erica was saying about the way in which school districts are demarcated in the United States, I mean, is for example, are the US and Canada learning from one another, or are they dealing with this fairly much in different ways? Maybe Erica, since you're based in the US, you could perhaps give us a view on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, and I haven't studied this, so much of it is new, but we do see examples of at the state level, people, for example, disseminating information and guidance to a certain extent to localities and sharing across states to a certain extent as well. So, for example, in San Francisco, you saw people developing learning hubs as a place where kids could go and access the technology and have some supervision and maybe access to some other activities if they had parents who were essential workers. And then we've seen other places that have picked up on that idea and run with it. But I kind of going back to this idea of how privatization fits in the notions of what are the routes we're going to take and what is the goal of education in these moments. I think though there is a certain kind of randomness to what people are picking up, it's not really random. There's certain trajectories that are already in motion that get picked up on. So if we think about where private companies are looking to capitalize on the pandemic, they're, I think, in a lot of ways doing so in ways that further the testing and punishment orientation towards schooling, right? So now what do teachers do? They've got to get kids to do work, and the kids are turning off their screens or maybe not showing up at all. And so then we have a whole slew of companies that are willing to come in and either provide more tests to know where kids are, even though there's no shortage of tests to begin with. These are the products they already have, or to proctor, right? Or so some of these, things can be furthered in a way that's not random. And there's less, I think, evidence that the privatization piece is going to move forward in ethics of care, as Kathy was talking about, or to some extent, maybe there's industry and social emotional learning and responses to that, but not nearly at the kind of same scale as the other directions. So
yeah,
that's what I would say. There's some variety, but maybe there's an underlying set of structures and logics that are pretty strong.
Sure. Kathy, did you want
without some other kind of intervention, which we've noted some ways in which different groups are trying to intervene in that.
I think there are a number of ways in which we need to worry about the role of private tech companies. I think the one that I've only suddenly sort of thought about now, and I know there's some debate about it, is, with the kind of education happening in the home much more, there's the opportunity for much more surveillance of children in the home as well. And I think that can be very problematic. There's data collection on kids. There's, the question of invasion of privacy. Now that's happening in the home, not only in the classroom, where it can still be surveilled by, teachers and the unions and so on. But now it's actually extending into the home. I mean, I think that those sort of public-private divisions, we really need to look at very, very carefully. Other aspects of the role of private companies. I mean, I think public-private partnerships. I know yesterday the panelists spoke about a huge public-private partnership, I think, in Korea. I mean, I think we have to be very, very much more mindful than we are about what's happening with public-private partnerships in terms of, big data and intrusions of privacy and those kinds of things. The other way in which I think that private companies might be making problematic gains at the moment is, for example, through the setting up of further private schools. Learning itself being privatized, and particularly because they can offer possibly forms of schooling which rely on remote learning and so on. There's a school opening in Cape Town which is talking about that it's going to just be based on remote learning now. So I think that for me, the point that I made at the end of my talk is that it's, stressing the notion of education as a public good. That doesn't mean that we can't have any public-private partnerships, but we have to stress that education is a public good. And we have to be very mindful of the dangers of privatization in this context, the opening of education to the market.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for ending on that particular note. I mean, we need to be conscious of a lot of things. One of the things I wonder indeed is, we've talked about what governments need to do or what we would like governments to do. And Glenn mentioned how some governments do what we ask, they listen, some governments don't. We do hope that there will be more listening. And one of the questions I'm not going to have time to ask you, because we have actually reached the end of our time period, but it was to do with whether public awareness has changed over the period of the pandemic, whether in terms of what has happened, public awareness is such that we are going to come out of this with a different worldview in terms of how we deal with the particular problems we have in our societies. And through all of your really quite brilliant summaries and insights of the situation that we do find ourselves in, there's a lot to answer, and I think we as schools of education and those of us who work in schools of education, we have an enormous role to play. I think it was John Dewey who said something like, education is life. And I think that's something we all share and we all believe in. And I would very much like to thank my wonderful panel here today from across the world. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to be with you and to see you. And I do hope that we will be getting together again sooner rather than later. And I'd also like to just thank everybody who came and attended and has been part of this evening's event and who have asked questions in the chat line. I hope I managed to do some justice to that. And so it really, all that's left to me now is to say a warm and generous goodbye to you and wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.